One sentence was enough to change the temperature of the room. When Trump said Greenland, this stopped being about geography. It became a test of power, a test of how far a sentence could travel before the system pushed back in that moment. No one heard ice or land. They heard permission. This did not begin on a stage. It began between closed doors, in quiet conversations where tone matters more than words. Davos was already tense. Inflation was unresolved. Supply chains were fragile. Capital was cautious. Everyone arrived knowing the system was under strain. What no one expected was how casually a new line would be crossed. The message itself was short, unofficial, never meant for headlines. A private exchange involving Trump and Macron passed along the way. These things always are. No transcript, no confirmation. Just enough consistency in the retelling to make it real. And when Greenland entered the conversation, something shifted. Not emotionally, structurally, markets did not panic. That detail matters. There was no crash, no dramatic sell-off, no screaming red numbers. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Capital paused. Risk desks slowed approvals. Long-term positions were quietly reassessed. The question was not whether Greenland could be bought. The question was what it meant that it could be spoken about this way, because systems are built on precedent. Once a boundary is treated as negotiable, it stops being a boundary. Trump's words did not threaten action. They introduced possibility, and possibility is poison for pricing models. The moment an unthinkable outcome becomes discussable, its cost must be calculated. That calculation takes time. During that time, money waits. This is where economics enters the story. Capital does not react to noise, it reacts to uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than fear. The moment investors realized this was not a joke, not a provocation, but a signal, behavior changed. Not publicly, privately, exactly where real decisions are made. On the European side, the implications were just as serious. For Macron, Greenland was never the issue. The issue was visibility. If strategic territory could be referenced this openly by an ally, then Europe's internal red lines were no longer internal. Silence would be interpreted as consent. Overreaction would expose weakness. The response had to be measured, controlled, and deliberately incomplete. That incompleteness was intentional, because in global power dynamics, clarity can be a liability. Davos functions on that principle. It is not a conference, it is a marketplace of intentions. No one announces their price, everyone watches reactions. Trump's comment landed in that market like a weight dropped into still water. The ripples were subtle, but they reached every table. NATO analysts noticed immediately, not because of politics but because of infrastructure. Greenland is not symbolic in military planning. It is logistical, radar coverage, air corridors, northern Atlantic control. These are not debated in public forums, but they define private strategy. Trump's remark suggested that topics once handled only in classified rooms might now be tested in daylight. That possibility alone forced recalculation. Because once strategic silence is broken, it cannot be restored. Even if nothing happens, even if no proposal follows, the damage is already done. The system must adapt to the fact that the line was crossed without consequence. And that is what unsettled markets most. There was no immediate penalty, no diplomatic backlash strong enough to reset the boundary, which meant the system was absorbing the shock rather than rejecting it. Absorption creates precedent. Precedent reshapes behavior. Here is the uncomfortable part. No one needed to agree with Trump for this to matter. Opposition was irrelevant. What mattered was that the idea moved freely through elite networks without being shut down. That freedom is rare, and when it appears, it signals a shift in what is permissible. Greenland became unsellable in that moment. Not because it was protected, but because it was transformed. It stopped being a place and became a symbol. A symbol of how easily the language of power can turn territory into a variable. Symbols cannot be priced, they can only be tested. This is how modern crises form. Not through declarations, through hesitation, through quiet adjustments made by people who sense change before it becomes visible. By the time the public hears about it, the positioning is already done. Nothing had collapsed yet. No policy had changed, no deal had been proposed. And still the system was no longer the same. Everyone understood that the next sentence would matter more than the last. Because once a door opens even slightly, the question is no longer who opened it. The question is who will close it. The shift did not show up on television screens. It appeared inside spreadsheets, compliance memos, and internal risk calls that never get recorded. Once Greenland entered the realm of possibility, the system did what it always does when certainty weakens. It tightened. The first reaction came from capital allocators, not hedge funds chasing volatility, but pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, long-horizon money that survives by avoiding surprises. These institutions do not speculate on headlines. They price environments, and the environment had just changed. Not violently, quietly, which made it harder to measure. Approvals slowed, exposure limits were reviewed. Projects tied to Arctic logistics, energy routes, and defense infrastructure were quietly flagged. No public announcements followed. There was no need. In modern finance, hesitation is a decision. And enough hesitation, layered across institutions, becomes pressure. This is how economic stress begins now. Not with collapse, but with friction. Payments that take longer to clear. Deals that require one more signature. Committees that ask for updated assumptions. Each delay seems rational in isolation. Together they reduce velocity. And velocity is what keeps the system alive. Energy markets felt it next. Not because Greenland itself produces oil or gas at scale, but because Arctic stability underpins future routing assumptions. LNG shipping paths, subsea cable planning, insurance models tied to northern passages. All of these depend on predictable governance. When predictability weakens, premiums rise. Higher premiums mean higher costs. Higher costs mean postponed investment. Defense contractors noticed as well. Greenland sits inside a web of long-term planning that stretches decades forward. Radar upgrades, satellite alignment, airbase logistics. None of this reacts to tweets or speeches, but it reacts to shifts in what leaders believe they can say out loud. When strategic language changes, procurement logic follows. Inside Europe, the pressure manifested differently. The question was no longer about Trump. It was about response asymmetry. If the United States could introduce a destabilizing idea without consequence, Europe had to decide whether silence preserved stability or surrendered leverage. Either choice carried risk. Acting escalated. Waiting normalized. Macron's position reflected that dilemma. Public restraint, private recalibration, diplomatic channels stayed open, but the tone shifted. Less emphasis on reassurance, more emphasis on contingency. Europe began thinking not about preventing a scenario but about managing one if it emerged. This is where Davos mattered again. Away from cameras, the conversation narrowed. No one asked whether Greenland would be sold. Everyone asked what else might soon become discussable. Trade corridors, sanctions enforcement, monetary coordination. Once one taboo breaks, others weaken. Markets read this accurately. Volatility remained controlled, but correlation increased. Assets that normally moved independently began reacting to the same signals. That convergence is a warning sign. It means diversity of expectation is shrinking. When everyone starts protecting against the same unknown, liquidity thins. Banks adjusted quietly. Stress scenarios were updated, not with dramatic assumptions, but with expanded ranges. That alone forces balance sheet conservatism. Credit becomes selective. Growth projections soften. Again, no crisis headline is required. The system self-restrains. The most dangerous part was the absence of resolution. No clear denial, no firm reaffirmation of boundaries. Ambiguity lingered. And ambiguity, when left unresolved, becomes a feature rather than a phase. Institutions begin to plan around it. This is how power expresses itself now. Not through command, but through tolerated uncertainty. A sentence is released into the system. Reactions are observed. Adjustments are made. If resistance is weak, the new baseline holds. Greenland remained untouched. No negotiation followed. No proposal surfaced. And yet its role had already changed. It was now part of a larger equation about how openly strategic assets could be discussed by dominant actors without triggering immediate pushback. For investors, the lesson was subtle but clear. The rules were not gone, but their enforcement was no longer automatic. That realization alters behavior faster than any policy change ever could. The system did not break, it adapted. And adaptation, when driven by fear of uncertainty rather than confidence and stability, always carries a cost. That cost does not appear on balance sheets right away. It accumulates, slowly, invisibly. Everyone waited for the next move, not because action was expected, but because silence itself had become informative. In a world where language reshapes markets, what is not said can matter more than what is, and that left a single unresolved tension hanging over the system. If this level of ambiguity could exist without consequence, then the crisis was not about territory at all. It was about whether restraint still had power. By the time the tension reached its peak, nothing dramatic had happened, and that was precisely the problem. No announcement arrived to reset expectations. No firm statement drew a line. The system was left to interpret silence, and silence is never neutral. In Washington, the absence of correction was read as optionality, not intent, not commitment, but room to maneuver. When language goes unpunished, it becomes a tool, not for action, but for calibration. How far can a signal travel before resistance forms? How much discomfort is tolerated before coordination emerges? These questions are never asked out loud. They are answered by observation. Europe felt the pressure of asymmetry. The United States could afford ambiguity. Its financial depth, military reach, and institutional dominance allowed it to absorb uncertainty without immediate cost. Europe could not. Fragmentation turns ambiguity into exposure. Every member state read the situation through its own vulnerabilities: energy dependence, trade access, security guarantees. The result was hesitation disguised as prudence. Markets sensed this imbalance. Pricing models adjusted not because of expected action, but because of delayed response. When the system fails to close a loop, risk migrates. It moves from the center to the edges. From public markets to private agreements. From transparent mechanisms to discretionary ones. That migration is invisible to most observers, but it defines turning points. The dollar reflected this dynamic without spiking. Demand for safety assets increased, but not in panic. It was controlled, deliberate. Investors were not fleeing risk, they were narrowing it. Narrowing concentrates pressure. When too many actors seek the same shelter, the shelter itself becomes fragile. Behind the scenes, policy coordination slowed, informal alignments weakened, not because of disagreement, but because trust requires predictability. When predictability erodes, even allies hedge. Hedging creates distance. Distance reduces the speed of collective response, and delayed response allows uncertainty to harden. This is where the crisis matured, not as an event, but as a condition. A shared understanding that the boundaries governing strategic speech had shifted. That understanding changed incentives. Leaders became more careful in public, more experimental in private. Each test gauged reaction. Each reaction informed the next test. Greenland remained untouched physically, but strategically it had already been repositioned. It now existed inside a mental map of leverage, a reference point for what could be implied without escalation. Once an asset enters that map, it does not leave easily. It becomes part of future calculations, even if never mentioned again. The economic cost of this shift was diffuse but real. Investment timelines stretched. Insurance models recalibrated. Long-term projects required higher confidence thresholds. These adjustments did not reverse growth overnight. They softened it, gradually. Softening is harder to attribute, which is why it persists longer. The search for resolution faced a paradox. Any explicit clarification risked elevating the issue further. Any denial risked being read as weakness, so the system defaulted to managed ambiguity. That choice stabilized headlines but destabilized expectations. Stability without clarity is temporary. The most revealing signal came from what did not happen. No emergency summits, no coordinated statements, no visible attempt to restore the old boundaries. That absence confirmed what markets already suspected. The system was willing to live with this level of tension. Once that realization set in, behavior adapted, not toward confrontation, but toward caution. Caution, when widespread, becomes drag. Drag slows momentum, and momentum is the currency of modern economies. This is how power reshapes itself, not by forcing outcomes, but by altering the range of acceptable futures. When that range expands without resistance, authority consolidates quietly. No victory is declared, no defeat is acknowledged. The shift simply settles. For observers, the temptation is to wait for a climax, a deal, a statement, a reversal. But modern crises do not resolve cleanly. They dissolve into new baselines. What once seemed unthinkable becomes background noise. Greenland was never the objective. It was the probe. The response to the probe revealed more than any acquisition ever could. It showed where coordination weakened, where silence was tolerated, and where uncertainty could persist without penalty. By the time attention moved elsewhere, the lesson was already internalized. Language had proven its power, and restraint, once assumed to be automatic, was now conditional. The crisis did not end. It normalized. Normalization is the most durable outcome of all. Resolution was expected, it never came, and that absence was not a failure of diplomacy. It was a choice. In traditional crises, clarity restores order. A statement is issued, lines are redrawn, confidence returns. But this situation did not follow that pattern, because clarity would have required something the system was no longer willing to provide. Limitation. A firm declaration would have closed possibilities, and possibilities had become valuable. For Washington, ambiguity offered leverage without cost. Nothing had to be defended. Nothing had to be acted upon. The signal had already done its work. Markets adjusted, allies recalculated, boundaries softened, all without a single policy commitment. From a power perspective, this was efficiency. Europe understood this, even if it could not mirror it. A strong response risked fragmentation. A weak response risked normalization. The safest path was procedural stability. Keep institutions functioning. Keep language measured. Avoid confrontation. The goal shifted from resolution to containment. Containment does not remove tension, it manages it. And managed tension creates a new equilibrium. One that favors actors with scale, depth, and patience. Smaller systems depend on rules being explicit. Larger systems benefit when rules are flexible. That is why no definitive closure arrived. The system adapted to the uncertainty rather than eliminating it. Central banks did not intervene. Trade bodies did not issue warnings. Defense alliances maintained routine messaging. Normality was preserved on the surface, even as assumptions underneath shifted. This choice had economic consequences. Not catastrophic. Structural, long-term capital became more conservative. Strategic investment demanded higher margins of safety. Optionality was priced higher. Growth did not stop, it slowed. And slowing, when sustained, reshapes expectations across generations of planning. The public never felt a shock. And that was intentional. Modern power avoids visible disruption. It prefers friction that accumulates gradually. Friction discourages risk-taking. Discouraged risk dampens innovation. Over time, momentum transfers toward those who can operate comfortably within uncertainty. Greenland remained untouched, but it no longer needed to be mentioned. Its function was complete. It had served as a demonstration, a reminder that certain ideas could circulate freely without immediate correction. That circulation alone redefined the limits of acceptable discourse. The true resolution, if it can be called that, was psychological. Leaders adjusted their language, markets adjusted their tolerance, institutions adjusted their thresholds. No announcement marked the transition. It simply settled into place. This is the modern solution to crisis. Not decisive action, not reversal, normalization. Once attention becomes familiar, it loses its urgency. Once urgency fades, pressure dissipates. And when pressure dissipates, the underlying shift remains. The system did not return to where it was. It moved forward without acknowledging the change. That is how continuity is maintained without stability. The appearance of order masks the evolution beneath it. For those watching closely, the lesson was clear. Power no longer needs to conquer territory to reshape outcomes. It only needs to test language to see what travels, to observe what is absorbed, to note what goes unanswered. Greenland was not for sale, but something else was exchanged. A boundary, quietly, without negotiation, without resistance strong enough to reverse it. And once a boundary moves without consequence, it rarely moves back. That is where the story ends. Not with a deal, or a declaration, or a confrontation, but with a system that learned it could live with more uncertainty than it ever admitted before. And systems that accept uncertainty as normal do not seek closure, they seek control. Thank you for watching. If this perspective changed how you see power, you already know where to find Capital.